In the years between 1914 and 1918, the Great War reshaped not only borders and politics, but also the very fabric of daily life. With millions of men mobilized for combat, societies had to find new ways to keep economies and services running. Women stepped into that breach in large numbers and roles. Their contributions ranged from nursing on the front lines to keeping factories, farms, and transport systems operating at home, from serving in auxiliary military units to running offices and telephone exchanges, from volunteering in humanitarian relief to advancing the suffrage movement. Today, I want to talk about how women participated in and changed the war efforts, the nature of their work, the risks they faced, the social and political consequences that followed, and the complex legacy of their wartime service. When war broke out in 1914, nations expected a short conflict. Within months, it became clear that modern industrial warfare requires sustained production of weapons, food, and logistical support on a scale never seen before. This demand created labor shortages across the combatant countries. To fill these gaps, women moved into roles that had been largely closed to them before the war. Heavy industry, transport, agriculture, and the new naval and military auxiliaries. The scale of their contribution was enormous. In Britain alone, by the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of women were employed in munitions factories. Across the British Empire and in Allied nations, women served in the Women's Land Army as telephone operators, in auxiliary naval services, and in medical corps. The mobilization of female labor was a central plank of the Allied home front efforts and a practical necessity for sustaining prolonged total war. While many women initially joined the workforce out of necessity, their motivation often blended patriotism, economic needs, and a sense of adventure. Posters urged women to do their bit, and recruitment drives transforms this patriotic duty into a mass movement. For instance, in Britain, over 900,000 women worked in munitions by 1918, a figure unimaginable before the war. In France, the munitionettes de la Gueux became a cultural symbol, featured in newspapers and songs for their dedication and courage. The yellow-stained skin from TNT exposure even earned them the nickname Canary Girls. In Germany, women worked in factories producing shells and uniforms, often for 12 hours a day, despite ration shortages and air raids. These efforts revealed the new industrial phase of war. One fought not only in trenches but also on assembly lines run by women. Before 1914, many women's economic activities remained tied to the home. Local trades or gendered professions such as domestic service, teaching, or nursing. The war disrupted these expectations. Munitions factories, the engines of the war economy, recruited women for dangerous, skilled, and often highly paid work. These munitionettes and other factory workers performed jobs ranging from testing explosives to assembling shells and sewing aircraft components. The work was hazardous. At several sites, explosions and exposure to toxic chemicals caused injury and death. Yet these positions also offered opportunities. Wages were relatively good compared with pre-war female employment, and women developed technical skills previously denied to them. Beyond the factories, women staffed an array of communications and administrative roles that kept armies and governments functioning. Telephone operators, including the so-called Hello Girls in American services, maintained battlefields and command communications. Switchboard operators and telegraph staff were essential links between frontline units and rear services. Women worked in offices as clerks, typists, and administrators, in transport as drivers, conductors, and mechanics, and in ports and rail yards loading and dispatching supplies. These roles marked a major shift. Women were no longer limited to the easiest or most socially acceptable forms of employment, but were entrusted with responsibilities that had direct military consequence. Nursing and medical work forms a visible and deeply human part of women's wartime contribution. From voluntary Red Cross units to formal nursing services attached to armies, women cared for the wounded, sanitation and hygiene, and provided comfort to soldiers. Many women served near the front in improvised hospitals, casualty clearing stations, or as ambulance drivers, exposed to danger while performing vital medical work. Women doctors and surgeons, though fewer in number and often restricted by medical hierarchies, also served courageously, challenging prejudices about female professional capability. One of the most remarkable examples of female medical leadership came from Dr. Elsie Inglis, a Scottish physician and suffragist. Rejected by British War Office when she offered to send medical units to the front, she famously was told to go home and sit still. Instead, she organized the Scottish Women's Hospitals for Foreign Service, which sent all-female medical teams to France, Serbia, and Russia. Her hospitals treated thousands of soldiers and civilians, even under enemy fire. Similarly, Dr. Rosalie Slaughter Morton, an American surgeon, led medical units across Europe and later became a key advocate for women's inclusion in professional medicine. Their courage not only saved lives, but proved women's capacity for leadership and scientific skill in times of crisis. Although most combatant armies excluded women from frontline combat, the First World War saw the official creation of numerous female auxiliary organizations. Britain, for example, organized units such as the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps, the Women's Royal Naval Service, and Women's Royal Air Force. These organizations carried out essential rear area duties, from cooks and clerks to mechanics and drivers, freeing men frontline service. Similarly, in the United States, women were recruited into roles such as yeoman in the Navy, performing clerical and communications work that were previously male-dominated. These developments displayed a dramatic transformation in how governments regarded women's utility in wartime. The creation of women's military auxiliaries also introduced new forms of discipline and identity. Members of Britain's WAAC wore khaki uniforms, lived in camps, and followed military orders, a sharp break from pre-war expectations of female behavior. Many wrote diaries describing both pride and discomfort. Some found the strict regimentation empowering. Others struggled with military hierarchy and social scrutiny. In the United States, over 11,000 yeomen enlisted, performing administrative work at naval bases and shipyards. Loretta Perfectus Walsh, the first female U.S. Navy petty officer, became a symbol of changing gender roles. Although barred from combat, these women showed that national defense could no longer be defined solely by male participation. Food production was critical, with shipping threatened by enemy submarines and domestic labor drained by enlistment. Agricultural output needed urgent support. The Women's Land Army, organized in Britain and with counterparts in other countries, recruited women to work farms, plow fields, tend livestock, and harvest crops. The image of women doing heavy agricultural labor challenged pre-war gender norms and highlighted how war demanded practical changes in social roles. These women often worked long hours in difficult conditions but were vital to national food security. Life on the land was far from idyllic. Many land girls lived in basic hostels or farm cottages and performed grueling physical labor, plowing, milking, and threshing by hand. Yet, many recorded pride in their strength and self-resilience. One British land girl, Alice Hargreaves, wrote in her diary, "For the first time, I feel useful, not as a daughter or a sister, but as a worker for my country." In Australia and Canada, women's agricultural labor mirrored these experiences. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Women's Land Army, inspired by its British counterpart, trained thousands of volunteers to harvest crops and tend war gardens. The sight of women in breeches driving tractors became a striking image of wartime transformation. Working in war industries or auxiliaries brought real risk. Shell factories did explode. Exposure to chemicals sometimes led to long-term health problems. Women serving near front lines faced shelling, disease, and the constant psychological strain of dealing with mass casualties. Yet despite their sacrifices, recognition and veterans' rights varied widely. Some women received equal pay and pension benefits, while others, often treated as civilian contractors, had to fight for acknowledgement of their service decades later. The case of the American Hello Girls illustrates this injustice. Although they performed military communications work, they were not immediately recognized as military veterans and only received formal recognition many years after the war ended. Individual cases highlight these struggles. Grace Banker, chief operator of the American Signal Corps Hello Girls, received the Distinguished Service Medal for her work maintaining communications during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, yet her team waited 60 years for formal veteran status. In munitions factories, the 1917 Silvertown explosion in London killed over 70 workers, most of them women, when TNT ignited. Survivors were left with life-changing injuries, but few received long-term compensation. These stories illustrate that while women's labor was celebrated publicly, their welfare and recognition were often neglected once peace returned. Perhaps the most consequential long-term effect of women's wartime service was political. The presence of women in the workforce, their visible competence in technical and organizational tasks, and their patriotic service created powerful arguments for extending political rights. In several countries, the post-war period saw critical advances in women's suffrage. Britain, for instance, extended limited voting rights to some women in 1918 and equalized the franchise in 1928, changes shaped in part by the wartime context that demonstrated women's commitment to the national cause. In the United States, women's campaigning for the vote, combined with wartime patriotism and service, influenced President Wilson and Congress to pass the 19th Amendment in 1920. The war produced a new public image of women, efficient, resilient, and capable. Propaganda and recruitment posters reframed women's roles as essential to victory, while post-war memorialization often emphasized male competence. Female contributions were sometimes sidelined in popular memory, but cultural works, oral histories, and museum exhibitions in later decades have recovered their stories, from munitionettes to nurses, drivers to land girls. Exhibitions and documented personal accounts reveal full range of women's experiences, from pride and empowerment to exhaustion and grievance. Communication was life. Telephone and telegraph operators, many of them women, ran the nerve centers of modern armies. The American Hello Girls, who served in France as telephone operators, provided skilled bilingual communications essential to the coordination of moving units and artillery. Despite their wartime role, questions of civilian status and military recognition surfaced after the war, reflecting broader tensions about women's place in military structures. Their experience underscores how gender norms and institutional rules complicated the path from wartime service to peacetime recognition. Munitions work provides perhaps the most vivid example of the wartime transformation. In Britain and elsewhere, women filled factories that produces shells, fuses, and explosives. Many were organized into shift work, where speed and skill determined the delivery of ammunition to the front. The occupational hazards were evident: explosions, exposure to TNT and other chemicals, and maternity issues linked to toxic dust. Yet the work offered relatively high wages and a new sense of economic independence for many women. Where once women were restricted to domestic and low-paid roles, wartime industries made them indispensable to national survival. Women's wartime roles were not unique to Britain or the United States. Across Europe, within the British Empire, and among allied nations, women took on vital responsibilities. From New Zealand and Australia to Canada, from India to South Africa, women served as nurses, factory workers, agricultural laborers, administrative staff, and volunteers. In occupied Europe, women's contributions were complicated by resistance activities, forced labor, or survival under occupation. The global scope of women's service demonstrated both the universality of wartime demands and the local differences in how societies adapted to them. Not all women supported the war uncritically. Various suffragist groups and women activists debated the logic of supporting war in the name of democracy when many at home lacked full rights. Some groups promoted pacifism and worked for negotiated peace. Others split from suffrage organizations to support war efforts. These political tensions reflected broader questions about citizenship, rights, and the relationship between national service and political recognition. By the 1920s and 1930s, many societies had changed. Women's wartime service accelerated social transformation. It reshaped labor markets, altered public perceptions of women's capacities, and helped create political momentum for legal reforms, including suffrage and labor protections. Yet progress was uneven and incomplete. Many women returned to pre war roles, faced wage inequality, and found their wartime gains temporary in some sectors. Still, the war had opened doors for employment, for education, and for civic participation that could not be fully shut again. Museums, archives, and historians continue to uncover personal stories that complicate and enrich our understanding of how the war affected gender relations. The role of women in World War I was both pragmatic and revolutionary. They stepped into factories, fields, hospitals, offices, and communication centers, sustaining economies and militaries while demonstrating skill, courage, and resilience. Their service helped redefine gender norms and contributed to political change, including advances in suffrage and recognition. At the same time, their experiences revealed the limits of wartime transformation. Not all gains were permanent. Recognition was uneven, and many women paid a heavy personal price for their service. The story of women in World War I is essential for understanding the broader social consequences of total war and the slow, contested expansion of women's public lives in the 20th century.